Our gospel reading this morning is from the 3rd chapter of Matthew. All 4 of the gospels report in their own way the baptism of Jesus. Curious that only one bothers to tell a Christmas story, but all 4 tell of Jesus' baptism. It's an event that likely was a little bit troublesome for the first Christians. We may not realize that. Raised issues. If John's baptism was a baptism of repentance for sins, why did Jesus need it? Did John baptizing Jesus mean that somehow John was bigger and more important than Jesus? All of the Gospels in different ways address those questions, and you'll perhaps hear Matthew's way of doing that when he tells the story. But one of the things that you'll clearly hear is Matthew begins to look forward to the Christian practice of baptism in Jesus' baptism, where people are incorporated into God's family and where they are gifted with the Spirit. So let us listen now to hear what the Spirit may speak to us through these words. Then Jesus came from Galilee to John at the Jordan to be baptized by him. John would have prevented him, saying, "I need to be baptized by you. Do you come to me?" But Jesus answered him, "Let it be so now, for it is proper for us in this way to fulfill all righteousness." Then he consented. And when Jesus had been baptized, just as he came up from the water, suddenly the heavens were opened to him, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting on him. And the voice from heaven said, "This is my Son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased." The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. It's an old joke, so no doubt I've told it before. If you've heard it, just bear with me. A group of pastors are gathered for a lunch meeting. And I assume when other professions gather for lunches, the same sort of thing happens. There's a lot of talking shop. There's some whining and some complaining and some ideas sharing. What are you guys doing for Lent this year? That sort of thing. Well, at this particular lunch gathering, one of the pastors shares that the congregation she serves is having a problem with bats. They've discovered a huge colony of bats in the steeple, and they don't know what to do about it. She doesn't want to hurt them, but they're starting to make quite a mess, and they need to get rid of them. Have any of the other pastors had any experience with this in their congregations? And one colleague shares with her the name of a local pest removal company. Another pastor suggests getting one of those electronic ultrasonic repellers, for pests. And so we tried that. It didn't work. Finally, another pastor says, "We had the same problem a few years ago. We decided to enroll all of them in confirmation class. When it ended, we never saw one of them again." Now, for those who might not be from our tradition, confirmation is step 2 in a 2-step process for becoming a full-fledged member of a Presbyterian church. Step 1 is baptism, which very often happens when a child is an infant. Confirmation then happens more towards the teenage years, and it includes a public profession of one's faith. In confirmation, the people confirm the vows that were made over them at baptism. And they claim as their own the faith of their parents or their guardians. Unfortunately, confirmation has a long history in the Presbyterian Church of becoming a graduation. Children are baptized. They grow up in the Sunday school class. And then as teenagers, they go through confirmation and make their professions of faith, and then largely disappear. Now, for much of the 20th century, they often came back when they got married and had children of their own. But that pattern has largely broken down. By the latter part of the 20th century, many of those who graduated never returned. Now, I sometimes wonder if we in the church didn't really set ourselves up for this. In a variety of ways, we have portrayed Christian faith as a kind of status. Evangelicals sometimes speak of being born again or saved. But then what? We Presbyterians rarely use the language of born again and being saved, but we still tended to treat Christian faith as a status. In many Presbyterian congregations, Sunday school is understood to be something for children. Well, that presumes it's something that you're done with at some point, right? You finish, you graduate, you get your Christianity pin. Some parents even decide to skip a step and simply make baptism the graduation too. They get the baby done. I didn't make that phrase up. I've had people come to me saying, we want to get the baby done. This is usually something instigated by the grandparents, by the way. And they get the baby done, and then they never go near a church again. Now, theologically speaking, Presbyterians do infant baptism because we understand God to be the primary actor in baptism. God claims us in the waters as beloved children. God embraces us and says, you are mine. God's love is always there. It's there before we acknowledge God or before we acknowledge Jesus. And so we baptize the children of those who say they themselves will follow Jesus and will help the child to learn about God's love in Jesus. When a child gets older, he or she will have to decide whether to respond to God's embrace, to God's love that has claimed her. As with human parents, who typically love their child unconditionally from the moment of birth without waiting to figure out whether they're going to be a decent kid or not, God embraces us in love, embraces us in the waters, hoping that as we grow older, we will learn to love God back through lives of discipleship. Of course, none of this theology of baptism was really necessary back when the Jesus movement first got started, nearly 2,000 years ago. Christian faith was a new thing. No one had grown up in it yet. And so when people were claimed by God's love in baptism as a son or a daughter of God and decided to love God back as disciples, it all happened at the same time. People were baptized, people made their professions of faith, and they received this new identity as a son or daughter of God and became disciples of Jesus. This was not a graduation. This was not an achieving of a status. This was a beginning of a whole new way of living. And perhaps that's why that originally the church had a big celebration to mark the baptism of Jesus, while it scarcely noticed Christmas. Some of us are in a kind of post-Christmas letdown right now. But today, on this day, the Christians of the first centuries celebrated that Jesus was beginning his ministry and that they were beginning new lives as his followers. Now, don't get me wrong, Christmas is wonderful. I'm sure many of you enjoyed the special music, the special worship that goes with the season. It is great to celebrate that God's love for us is so great that it would become human, that it would become vulnerable as a newborn babe. But the baby Jesus does not ask much of us. We can ooh and ah over him for a bit, and then we move on. January's here. Christmas is over. Life goes back to how it was before Christmas started. We celebrated the birth of the Prince of Peace, but then Iran and the U.S. threatened each other with the horrors of war. The opening statement in the baptism service that is outlined in the Presbyterian Book of Common Worship invites the entire congregation, all those who are gathered, to remember with joy our own baptism as we celebrate this sacrament. But many of us were baptized as infants. We can't remember it. But that's not the sort of remembering that the liturgy has in mind. It's calling us to remember the meaning of our baptism. It's calling us to remember who we are. In the Disney movie, The Lion King, young Simba is at one point called to remember who he is. If you've not seen the movie, Simba, as a cub, has run away into a kind of self-imposed exile. He blames himself for the death of his father, Mufasa, a death that was actually done by Scar, Simba's evil uncle. Scar then takes over the kingdom and leads it into ruin. At a critical point in the movie, Simba has a vision of his late father who speaks to him and says, "You have forgotten who you are, and so you have forgotten me." Remember who you are. This remembering is not a recalling something that happened. It is a remembering of his true identity, who he truly is. And only then will Simba be able to bring the kingdom back to peace and harmony. Remember who you are. In his baptism, Jesus is confronted with his identity. "This is my Son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased." And Jesus' awareness of this identity drives him into a time of testing where he must hone and discover what it means to be God's beloved Son. A Messiah who will not be the expected conquering hero, who will not seek to aggrandize himself. When Jesus realizes and remembers fully who he is, he casts his lot with the weak and the lowly. He rejects the way of empire and violence, and he gives himself for others, even to the point of death. Remember who you are. in our baptisms, whether as infants or as adults. We are given new identities as daughters and sons of God. It is an identity that, when it is fully lived out, looks very much like Jesus. It is especially concerned with the weak and the lowly. It rejects empire and the way of violence. And it gives itself for others. But we so often forget who we are. If only everyone who professes to be Christian might have a vision of Jesus speaking to them and saying, "You have forgotten who you are, and so you have forgotten me. Remember who you are. Remember, you have been claimed in the waters of baptism, claimed as a beloved and cherished child, and called to be Christ-like. You have been joined to Jesus and called to Christ-shaped life. Remember." Oh, how different the world might look if we all remembered who we truly are.